A financial services executive sits in a board meeting while the CFO presents quarterly revenue forecasts pulled directly from Copilot. Two numbers appear on the screen, but they contradict each other by 18%. The room goes quiet because nobody knows which one is real. The system is operating exactly as it was designed to function. It is respecting your permissions and following every protocol, but the underlying data is simply corrupt. This is not a software problem. It is an architectural confession. The moment Copilot begins to synthesize across your fragmented data sources, every gap you have ignored for a decade becomes visible. Every duplicate record and every permission you granted just in case suddenly matters. Every version of the truth that was never unified is now on display. To understand why Copilot will change business forever, you first need to understand what this technology actually is. It is not what you think. Copilot is not a productivity tool. Most organizations treat Copilot like a standard chatbot or a clever assistant that makes work faster. They use it to draft emails, summarize meetings in seconds, or analyze spreadsheets without manual review. The story they tell themselves is that this is a productivity multiplier. That is a comfortable lie. Architecturally, Copilot is something else entirely. It is a distributed decision engine operating across your entire Microsoft 365 estate. The Orchestrator layer sits between the user and the Microsoft Graph, which represents your entire organizational knowledge base in API form. Every email, document, conversation, and transaction becomes queryable input for AI reasoning in real time. This means Copilot does not create new access, but it does expose existing access at a scale humans could never achieve. A user with read permissions to 50,000 files can now generate summaries of every single document in a matter of seconds. The system respects the permission boundary, yet it operates at machine speed across dimensions of context that no human could manually traverse. That distinction matters. It transforms permission drift from an invisible background noise into an amplified liability. This is the uncomfortable truth. Copilot will force every organization to confront the data entropy they have been ignoring for decades. Data entropy is the gradual degradation of data quality over time, and it manifests as duplicates, outdated records, and conflicting versions of the truth. Most organizations have normalized this chaos as just the way data works. Legacy systems accumulated, mergers created, and departmental silos guarantee it. You have learned to live with the mess by building workarounds and training people to know which system to trust on Tuesday versus Friday. Copilot changes this calculus permanently. When an AI system synthesizes across fragmented data sources, entropy becomes immediately visible as hallucinations. The system will confidently present contradictory information because the underlying data contradicts itself. One financial services firm deployed Copilot for deal analysis, but the system generated forecasts by pulling from both current pricing models and archived versions. The recommendations were internally inconsistent, not because the AI was broken, but because the data estate was broken. Organizations now face a binary choice: fix the data architecture or accept that your AI will inherit the same chaos. This forcing function is permanent. Copilot will not get better at handling bad data through model updates, which means organizations must get better at managing their data. That is not an optional step. That is architectural law. Organizations with clean data, clear permissions, and unified governance will see exponential returns. Those without those foundations will see exponential risk. The mandate is not to simply adopt Copilot, but rather to fix your data architecture before Copilot exposes you. Exposure in this context does not mean a traditional data breach. It means your board will watch your AI system present contradictory revenue forecasts, while your sales team watches Copilot generate proposals from outdated customer records. Your security team will watch Copilot summarize files it should never have seen because permissions were never cleaned up. The system is operating correctly. Your organization is not. The architecture of mandatory transformation. If you want to understand why this transformation isn't optional, you have to look at the Copilot middleware layer. This isn't a choice you make, it is architectural inevitability. The Copilot Orchestrator sits directly on top of Microsoft Graph, which is essentially your entire organizational knowledge base converted into API form. Every email you send, every document you save, and every conversation or transaction you record becomes queryable input for the engine. While the system technically respects permissions, it only respects them as they currently exist in your environment, not as they should exist according to your security policy. This creates an immediate forcing function where organizations must either audit and fix their permissions or watch Copilot amplify their governance failures at machine scale. The mandate here isn't actually to adopt Copilot. The real mandate is to fix your data architecture before Copilot exposes how broken it is. 3 architectural pillars have now become non-negotiable for any functional enterprise. First, you have identity, where Microsoft Entra ID serves as the absolute permission source of truth for every access decision. Every user's scope must be defined, and every group membership must be audited, because these are the boundaries the engine will follow. Second, data governance through Microsoft Purview is no longer a luxury, as you need to know exactly what data exists and who can access it. You have to classify that data and enforce those policies at scale if you want the system to remain deterministic. Third, you must adopt Microsoft Graph-first Orchestration patterns where everything connects through APIs and respects the permission boundary. Organizations that try to resist this shift will find that Copilot quickly becomes a liability rather than a strategic asset. This won't happen because the technology itself failed to work. It will happen because the organization simply wasn't ready for the transparency the system provides. Consider the consequences when you deploy Copilot without first cleaning up your identity debt. A user with overly broad permissions might deploy the tool for a specific, narrow task, but the system still sees thousands of documents they shouldn't have access to. Copilot respects those permission boundaries, but it does so at machine speed, synthesizing data the user shouldn't be using in a matter of seconds. The system is operating exactly as it was designed to, but your organization is not. The problem gets worse when you deploy without unified data governance across your various silos. Your organization might have 3 separate customer databases living in Dynamics 365, a legacy system, and a regional spreadsheet. When a user asks for customer information, Copilot pulls from all 3 sources simultaneously and presents contradicting versions as equally valid. Your sales team gets confused, your board gets confused, and eventually your customers get confused. The system is operating correctly, but your data architecture is a mess. You see the same failure when you ignore graph-first orchestration patterns in favor of old habits. Many organizations have built custom point-to-point integrations and proprietary APIs that remain completely undocumented. Copilot cannot see these connections, it cannot traverse them, and it certainly cannot orchestrate across them. It becomes a tool that only works within the walls of Microsoft 365, unable to reach the actual systems that run your business. The system is operating correctly, but your integration architecture is failing you. This is why the mandate is permanent. This isn't actually about Copilot, it's about whether your organization can operate as a coherent, unified system. Copilot simply makes the existing incoherence visible to everyone. The forcing function is straightforward. Organizations that implement unified identity and strong governance will see exponential returns on their investment. Copilot becomes a decision engine that operates across clean, trusted data, making it both reliable and strategic for the business. Organizations without these foundations will instead see exponential risk as the tool becomes a hallucination machine. It will expose every gap in your architecture for the world to see. This is not a technology problem. It is an organizational failure that the technology is finally exposing. The uncomfortable truth is that most organizations are nowhere near ready for this level of scrutiny. They have built their IT estates over decades, accumulating technical debt and creating silos while granting permissions just in case someone might need them. They have never unified their data or implemented strong governance, and Copilot will force them to confront those mistakes immediately. This won't be a gradual realization, it will happen at scale and likely in front of the board of directors. The mandate is non-negotiable because the only other alternative is total organizational chaos. If you deploy Copilot without fixing your architecture, you are just automating your own dysfunction. If you fix the architecture first, you aren't just enabling a new tool, you are transforming how the entire organization operates. You are building a foundation for AI-driven decision-making and creating a competitive advantage that lasts. That distinction is everything. The data entropy problem becomes visible. Data entropy is the quiet, gradual degradation of data quality that happens over time in every large system. It isn't a dramatic event like a data breach, but rather the slow accumulation of duplicates and outdated records. Most organizations have normalized this entropy to the point where it's invisible, but that changes the moment you try to automate across it. Copilot changes the stakes because when an AI synthesizes fragmented data, entropy shows up as hallucinations. The system doesn't fail gracefully or tell you that it's confused by the conflicting inputs. Instead, it confidently presents contradictory information because the underlying data it was given is itself a contradiction. That isn't a bug in the software. It is the system faithfully reflecting the chaos of your own data estate. I saw this happen with a financial services firm that deployed Copilot to help with deal analysis. They expected the system to score opportunities and prioritize their pipeline, which should have led to faster deals and better visibility. What actually happened was that the system exposed 10 years of data rot in a single afternoon. The engine pulled from current pricing models and archived versions at the same time, referencing contracts stored in 3 different systems with different terms. The recommendations were internally inconsistent because the data estate was broken, not the AI. The firm eventually had to choose between fixing their architecture or accepting that Copilot would just amplify their problems. They spent 12 months on data consolidation and deduplication, and they discovered that the cleanup alone was worth $800,000 a year. Decision-making got faster because the duplicate effort disappeared and the sales teams stopped arguing over which record was the real one. Finance stopped having to reconcile conflicting numbers because the organization finally became coherent. Most organizations don't realize that this forcing function is a permanent change to how they must operate. Copilot isn't going to get better at handling bad data through some future model update. Organizations have to get better at managing their own information, which is an organizational challenge with no purely technological solution. The mandate usually reveals itself during the second phase of a rollout. The first phase is almost always impressive, with people saving time on drafts and getting quick meeting summaries, but the second phase is where the entropy becomes visible and the engine starts generating inconsistent recommendations. It pulls from conflicting sources and presents multiple versions of the truth as if they were all equally valid. Your board will start asking which forecast is real, and your security team will start wondering what the tool is actually seeing. The uncomfortable truth is that most organizations are not prepared for this kind of visibility. They have spent decades building silos and granting permissions just in case, never realizing that this debt would eventually come due. Copilot forces them to confront these issues immediately and at scale, often in front of their most important stakeholders. Organizations now face a very simple choice. Invest in data quality now or watch Copilot expose every gap in your architecture later. The first path requires a lot of discipline and patience, while the second path is faster but significantly more painful. Most companies choose the fast path, and then they act shocked when their AI system starts to hallucinate. The mandate is this: data entropy is no longer a hidden cost you can ignore. Copilot makes the rot visible, and visible problems eventually demand real solutions. You cannot work around this, and you cannot train your way past it. You have to fix the underlying architecture because that is now a law of the system. That is exactly why Copilot is going to change the way we do business forever. Permission drift as a systemic risk. Permission drift is the slow, silent erosion of your access control model. It almost always begins with a well-intentioned request where a user needs temporary access to a specific project, so you grant it. The project eventually ends, but the access is never revoked, and as years pass, that user retains permissions to sensitive data they haven't touched in a decade. When you multiply this pattern across an organization with thousands of users and millions of files, permission drift stops being a configuration error and becomes invisible infrastructure. Everyone operates within this fog of overprivilege, and because it feels functional, nobody ever questions it. That comfort disappears the moment Copilot arrives and begins operating at machine scale. The research surrounding this architectural decay is staggering. Data shows that 83% of at-risk files are overshared internally, while 17% are exposed to external actors. More than 15% of business-critical files currently carry erroneous permissions, and 90% of those documents are shared far outside the C-suite. This is not an edge case risk or a series of isolated mistakes, it is the organizational norm. This is how the modern enterprise actually functions on a day-to-day basis. Copilot does not break your permission boundaries, but it does navigate them with machine speed and terrifying efficiency. A single user who has been granted excessive access can now generate comprehensive summaries of thousands of documents in a matter of seconds. The system is not creating new security breaches, but it is automating the exploitation of the permission drift you already ignored. If a user has read access to 50,000 files because your cleanup process has failed, they can now query every single one of those files simultaneously through a single prompt. The system technically respects the boundary, but it operates at a dimension of scale that proves just how broken that boundary has become. Consider a real incident from January of 2026, where a configuration bug allowed Copilot to summarize emails from Outlook's drafts and sent items folders while bypassing DLP policies. The system was not hacking the environment, it was simply exposing the fact that the permission model was never designed for AI-scale synthesis. Users technically had access to their own folders, which is correct, but when Copilot synthesized that data at machine speed, it violated the original intent of your protective controls. The system performed exactly as it was programmed to, but the permission model failed to account for the new velocity of data consumption. This is the definition of systemic risk. Organizations that deploy Copilot without first performing a full-scale permission audit are essentially building a high-speed delivery system for their own data leakage. This failure does not happen because Copilot is broken, but because the underlying permission architecture is fundamentally flawed. Now, those flaws are being executed at machine speed. The forcing function is clear. Organizations must move towards zero-trust governance where access is justified by current intent rather than historical roles. This shift requires regular permission audits and the immediate revocation of access that no longer serves a business purpose. You must implement least privilege principles at scale and use tools like Microsoft Purview to classify data and enforce policies automatically. In this new reality, you have to treat permission drift as a critical security failure rather than an operational convenience. Most organizations will fight this change because audits are tedious and revoking access creates immediate friction. Users tend to complain when they lose the standard access levels they've relied on for years, and departments often push back when their broad permissions are finally questioned. Consequently, organizations delay the hard work and implement Copilot without fixing the foundation. They are then shocked when the system begins surfacing sensitive data to people who were never supposed to see it in the first place. The uncomfortable truth is that permission drift is a feature of how businesses actually operate, not a bug in the software. People accumulate access as they move through the company, roles shift, and projects expire, but the access remains. This is the standard state of the enterprise until you introduce an AI system that operates at machine scale, at which point the normal state becomes catastrophic. Copilot does not forgive your technical debt, it exploits it. Imagine an HR manager who was provisioned too broadly years ago and still has access to every employee record in the company. When they deploy Copilot for a simple performance analysis, the system pulls from compensation data, health records, and private notes simultaneously. Copilot is respecting the permission boundary, but it is synthesizing sensitive data in ways the manager never intended. The manager might not be trying to leak information, but the system makes that exposure inevitable at machine speed. This mandate forces a transition to a model where access is continuously justified by the task at hand. It is no longer enough to say a user has access because of their job title. Instead, they must have specific access for a specific duration to complete a specific task. That is the essence of zero-trust governance. And it is exactly what Copilot requires to function safely. Most organizations are simply not ready for that level of discipline. The forcing function is permanent and unforgiving. If you deploy Copilot without addressing your permission debt, you are simply automating your exposure to risk. If you fix the permissions first, you are building a foundation for trustworthy, AI-driven decision-making. That distinction is the difference between a successful deployment and an architectural disaster. The Quiet ROI Problem. Organizations are reporting genuine productivity gains, and the numbers behind those claims are impressive. Forrester has reported a 116% ROI over 3 years, while other case studies have documented returns as high as 1,500%. We see email drafting time dropping by 40% and meeting summaries saving users nearly half an hour every single day. These metrics are real and repeatable, but they hide an uncomfortable truth. These numbers measure the acceleration of individual tasks rather than the improvement of organizational throughput. That distinction matters. A developer using GitHub Copilot might complete their coding tasks 55% faster, which leads to pull requests merging 50% quicker. However, the secondary effect is that those pull requests grow 20% larger, which significantly increases the burden on code reviewers and security teams. While the time to draft improves, the time to own actually gets worse because ownership accountability becomes much harder to establish. The system is operating exactly as intended, but your organizational workflow was never designed to handle this much volume. Organizations tend to celebrate the gains they can easily measure, like drafting and summarization, while ignoring the hidden costs in review and security. The ROI is real, but it is often captured in a way that creates massive downstream friction. One financial services firm used Copilot to draft proposals twice as fast as before, but they soon realized those proposals required double the legal review because the AI-generated language was imprecise. They eventually had to hire more legal staff to keep up, meaning the drafting gains were completely offset by the new review costs. The total ROI remained positive, but it didn't look anything like the original projections. This is the Quiet ROI problem, where metrics look great in isolation but fail in context. You are measuring velocity without accounting for quality or ownership, and you are ignoring the fact that faster work often creates more work for someone else. Velocity that creates downstream bottlenecks is not true productivity. It is just moving the problem to a different department. The math usually works like this. A manager sees that Copilot saves her team 10 hours a week and calculates a $39,000 annual gain. When she compares that to a $30,000 licensing cost, the spreadsheet shows a healthy 130% ROI. What that spreadsheet misses is that the security validation and code review time for that team has doubled. Because it is harder to trace responsibility for AI-generated work, the entire cost structure of the project has shifted. The visible gains were real, but the invisible costs were just as significant, leaving the net ROI much smaller than the headline suggested. This is why the second forcing function of the mandate is so critical. Organizations have to redesign their entire workflows to capture the value Copilot enables rather than just measuring the time it saves. You have to rethink how code is reviewed and implement security frameworks that can operate at an AI-generated scale. You must establish clear ownership models for assisted work and start measuring end-to-end cycle times instead of individual task completion. Most companies refuse to do this, so they deploy the tool and celebrate the initial drafting gains while ignoring the downstream mess. Because they aren't redesigning the workflow, the gains are only partially captured and the hidden costs continue to pile up. The total ROI stays positive, but it remains a fraction of what it could be because the organization is only looking at the visible parts of the process. The uncomfortable truth is that the ROI of Copilot depends on organizational discipline rather than the technology itself. It depends entirely on whether your leadership is willing to redesign the way work flows to actually capture that value. Most are not, as they want the productivity boost without the pain of an operational overhaul, but that is simply not how the system works. The organizations that understand this reality will be the ones that optimize their review processes and implement new security frameworks. They will measure the end-to-end impact of the technology and establish models where ownership is never in question. These companies will capture the full ROI, while those who refuse to change will see only partial gains and growing friction. The mandate is simple. Copilot creates the potential for massive gains, but capturing them requires a total organizational transformation. You cannot just buy the licenses and expect the business to improve. You have to redesign the way work actually happens. This is not a suggestion, it is an operational law, and it is the reason Copilot will change the business landscape forever. The change isn't coming because the AI is revolutionary, but because the organizations that survive will have to become fundamentally different. The adoption plateau nobody talks about. Microsoft 365 Copilot recently hit 15 million paid seats, which is the headline the marketing department wants you to see. It is also a deeply misleading number. When you place 15 million seats against a backdrop of 450 million commercial Microsoft 365 users, you realize we are looking at a 3.3% penetration rate. This is the reality after 2 years on the market, despite being positioned as the fastest adoption of any new suite in the history of the company. 3.3% is not a successful rollout. It is a scattered collection of experiments. The plateau is real, and if you look closely, it is highly instructive. Paid subscriber market share actually contracted by 39% between July of 2025 and January of 2026. Microsoft watched their slice of the paid AI services market drop from 18.8% down to 11.5%, while their competitors gained significant ground. Both ChatGPT and Gemini increased their market share during the exact same window where Copilot began to slide. This is not a distribution problem, because Microsoft already owns the pipes. This is a value realization problem. The adoption data reveals a very specific pattern of behavior. Initially, 70% of users preferred Copilot because of the Office integration and the sheer convenience of having AI embedded in the tools they already use every day. However, after these same users tried the alternatives, only 8% decided to stick with the Microsoft offering. That represents a 90% drop-off rate. You are not looking at a retention issue, you are looking at a total preference collapse. Users chose Copilot because it was right there, but they chose something else because it was actually better. The distribution advantage was not enough to hide the functional shortcomings of the experience. This plateau highlights the massive gap between licensing a product and actually integrating it. Organizations are buying the seats, but they are failing to weave the technology into their core workflows. The space between we bought Copilot and Copilot changed how we work is exactly where the architectural mandate lives. Most enterprises remain stuck in the pilot phase, and while 70% of Fortune 500 companies have technically adopted the tool, they haven't moved past testing after 2 years. This isn't because the technology is broken, but because the organizational transformation required to make it useful hasn't happened yet. Real data from enterprise deployments makes the bottleneck very clear. Most organizations require 60 to 90 days of heavy security configuration before they can even consider a broad rollout. They stall in these pilots because the basic prerequisites are missing. Their data isn't unified, their permissions are a mess, and their governance frameworks simply do not exist. While the technology is ready to perform, the organization is not, so the software sits idle in a pilot group. Users experiment and productivity is measured, but then the leadership realizes the sheer scale of the work required to move forward, and the project stalls. The uncomfortable truth is that this adoption plateau is not a technical failure. It is an architectural failure. You cannot scale Copilot without first repairing your underlying infrastructure, and fixing that infrastructure requires time, discipline, and a level of investment most companies want to avoid. They want the productivity gains without the pain of transformation, but that is not how these systems behave. The mandate reveals itself inside this plateau. The organizations that successfully move from pilots into full production are the ones that did the boring foundational work first. They fixed their data architecture, they scrubbed their permissions, and they built real governance frameworks. Because they redesigned their workflows and measured the end-to-end impact, these organizations see Copilot become a transformative force. They see it change the way work actually flows through the system, creating a competitive advantage that actually lasts. Organizations that stay stuck in pilots are usually waiting for something to change. They are waiting for Copilot to get better, or for the technology to solve their internal problems, or for a competitor to move first so they can copy the homework. They are not waiting for anything useful. The technology is already good enough to provide value, but the problem is organizational readiness, and waiting around does nothing to fix a broken foundation. This plateau also tells us that the market is finally maturing. We are past the hype phase and the era of early adoption, and we have reached the point where organizations are asking difficult questions. They want to know the real ROI, the necessary infrastructure changes, and the true total cost of ownership. These are the correct questions to ask, even if the answers are uncomfortable. Real ROI demands transformation, the infrastructure changes are massive, and the total cost is much higher than the licensing fees suggest. This is the point where adoption curves typically flatten out. The early adopters have already made their move, and the mainstream is currently weighing the costs. Most will eventually decide that the transformation isn't worth the effort, but the few who decide it is will capture a durable advantage. The ones who walk away will inevitably fall behind. That is how technology adoption actually works. It isn't a universal wave, but a sharp bifurcation between organizations that are ready and those that are not. The mandate is simple. This plateau is not a failure, it is a signal. It is telling you that deployment without transformation is a waste of time. It is proving that integration without architectural readiness is only temporary, and that ROI without organizational discipline is a total illusion. The plateau separates the architects who understand the system from the managers who don't, and that separation is permanent. The governance failure cascade. Governance failures are not rare edge cases. In the modern enterprise, they are the standard operating procedure. 59% of business leaders admit they lack a clear AI implementation plan, despite believing that AI is essential for their survival. This isn't a matter of ignorance, but a reflection of organizational reality. Most enterprises have never built governance frameworks designed for a distributed decision engine. They built their rules for human workflows, approval chains, and documented processes, but Copilot operates entirely outside of those legacy structures. The statistics in SharePoint are staggering, as only 1% of granted permissions are actually being used by employees. This means 99% of your permissions are just dormant access vectors waiting to be exploited. Organizations inherit this governance debt from decades of just-in-case provisioning, where access is granted but never taken away. A user gets a promotion but keeps their old folders, a project ends but the site remains open, or a department restructures without anyone auditing the old groups. Years of this behavior turn permission sprawl into an invisible part of your infrastructure that everyone uses but nobody questions. Then Copilot arrives and starts operating at machine scale. This is where the cascade begins. Copilot does not forgive your technical debt. It actively exploits it. Consider a scenario where an HR manager with overprivileged access uses Copilot to run a performance analysis. Because their role was provisioned too broadly years ago, the system can see compensation data, health records, and private notes. Copilot is technically respecting the permission boundary you set, but it is now synthesizing all that sensitive data simultaneously. The manager isn't trying to leak information, but the system makes a massive data breach possible at machine speed. One user and one query can summarize thousands of sensitive records in seconds. When you multiply this across an entire organization, the risk becomes astronomical. You have dozens of users with messy access levels deploying Copilot for daily tasks, with each one operating inside a broken permission boundary. Because they are all accessing data they shouldn't see but technically can, the governance failures begin to compound. They stop being individual mistakes and become a systemic collapse of your security model. The mandate forces you to implement a zero-trust governance model where access is justified by current intent rather than a historical role. This requires a fundamental shift in how you think about identity, access control, and your audit trails. It means you have to perform regular permission audits and revoke access the moment it is no longer needed. You have to implement least privilege principles at scale and use tools like Microsoft Purview to classify data and enforce your policies automatically. Most organizations resist this work because auditing permissions is tedious and revoking access creates immediate friction. Users will always complain when they lose access to a system they've had for years, and departments will push back when you question their standard access levels. Consequently, organizations delay the hard work and implement Copilot without fixing the underlying governance. They are then shocked when the system exposes exactly how much sensitive data is being touched by people who should never have seen it. The uncomfortable truth is that these governance failures are structural rather than accidental. They are a natural feature of how organizations actually operate over long periods of time. People accumulate access, roles shift, and projects fade away without the access being revoked. This was considered normal behavior for decades. But when you deploy an AI system that operates at machine scale, that normal behavior suddenly becomes catastrophic. The cascade accelerates the moment you deploy Copilot across multiple departments at the same time. Every department has its own messy permission model and its own unique governance gaps, and Copilot operates within all of them simultaneously. The failures don't just add up, they interact with each other. A finance user with lingering sales access can now use Copilot to query revenue data, while an HR user might synthesize executive communications they were never meant to read. Each person stays within their technical boundary, but those boundaries are so broken that the scale of the analysis creates a massive liability. The mandate reveals itself through this cascade of failures. Organizations that take the time to implement strong governance before they hit the on switch will see Copilot become a strategic asset. Those that rush the deployment will watch the tool become a liability. This isn't because the technology is flawed, but because the governance infrastructure was already broken. Copilot simply makes that brokenness visible to everyone at scale. This forcing function is a permanent change to how you manage your environment. You cannot govern Copilot by trying to control the AI itself. You have to govern the data and the permissions that the AI lives on. That is not a suggestion. It is an architectural law. Governance failures cascade because Copilot doesn't create new risks out of thin air. It amplifies the risks you already had. And in most organizations, those failures are everywhere. Case Study 1. Sales Pipeline Acceleration, Dynamics 365 Copilot. Moving from abstract architectural problems to concrete business transformation, we see how Copilot actually behaves when it is deployed into real workflows. A mid-market financial services firm recently put Dynamics 365 Copilot to work for sales pipeline analysis. The expected outcome was straightforward because they wanted faster deal scoring and better opportunity prioritization, but the actual outcome exposed everything we have been discussing regarding data entropy, permission drift, and governance debt. The numbers looked impressive at first. They saw an 18% time savings on proposal drafting and a 22% reduction in the overall proposal cycle time. Because 5% more opportunities were identified in the same pipeline, the ROI was real. When the organization celebrated, they pointed to approximately $1.8 million in additional pipeline value created annually. They believed they had proven Copilot worked, but the real mandate only revealed itself during Phase 2. The system's accuracy depended entirely on the quality of the data sitting in the CRM. Duplicate accounts, incomplete customer records, and inconsistent pipeline stage definitions were not new problems. These issues had always existed, but the organization had simply learned to work around them over the years. Sales reps knew which customer record was real, and they knew which pipeline stage definitions to trust based on their own experience, which meant they had built informal workarounds that Copilot did not have. Copilot operated at machine scale across all the data simultaneously. This meant it synthesized across duplicate records and pulled from incomplete fields. It made recommendations based on inconsistent definitions because the system was operating correctly while the data architecture was not. The result was the generation of hallucinations. It would recommend pursuing opportunities that had already closed, or it would suggest deals that had been merged in the CRM but never deduplicated. The sales team stopped trusting the system when it pulled customer information from multiple conflicting records and presented them as equally valid. The organization was forced to make a choice. They could either fix the data estate or accept that Copilot would amplify their existing data problems at scale. They chose to fix it, even though that meant 12 months of difficult work involving data consolidation across 3 separate systems and the deduplication of thousands of customer records. Standardization of pipeline stage definitions and the implementation of data governance frameworks followed. They enforced mandatory fields and started regular data quality audits because the work was necessary. Data quality improvements alone generated $800,000 in additional value annually, and this happened independent of Copilot's direct ROI. Decision-making got faster because duplicate effort disappeared and sales teams stopped arguing about which customer record was real. The organization became coherent once Copilot started operating on clean data. Recommendations became reliable and the system finally became strategic. The mandate revealed itself in this transformation because the organization did not actually deploy Copilot just to get faster deal scoring. They deployed Copilot and discovered they needed unified data which generated value independent of any AI system, making the organization more efficient and more trustworthy because Copilot acted as the forcing function. This is the pattern we see repeatedly. Organizations deploy Copilot expecting incremental productivity gains, and they usually get them. Then they discover that Copilot's limitations expose their architectural gaps, and fixing those gaps generates value that exceeds the direct ROI of the AI. The technology is the catalyst, but the transformation is organizational. Most companies do not make it to this point because they see the hallucinations and lose trust. They abandon the deployment without ever discovering that the problem was their data architecture. The mandate forces you to confront this reality. You must either fix your data or accept that your AI will hallucinate. That is not an optional step, it is architectural law. This organization's transformation matters because it is not about Copilot, it is about what Copilot forces an organization to become. Case Study 2, Service Desk Deflection, Power Platform plus Copilot Studio. The mandate extends beyond individual productivity and into the realm of operational transformation. An enterprise technology company recently deployed Copilot Studio to automate their Tier 1 service desk triage. Their goal was straightforward, as they wanted to reduce ticket volume by 30%. The initial result was a 28% deflection rate, which created an estimated annual savings of $1.2 million, but the actual transformation remained invisible. The system forced the organization to do something they had never done before. They had to document every resolution pattern, every decision tree, and every escalation rule. Knowledge that had existed only in the heads of individual experts became explicit, codified, and automatable. A senior support engineer might know how to diagnose network connectivity issues because he had built mental models over many years, allowing him to troubleshoot by intuition, but Copilot Studio cannot operate on intuition. It required explicit rules to function. If the user reports dropped packets, the system must ask about recent network changes. If they report latency spikes, it must check for bandwidth saturation. If they report intermittent failures, it must investigate DNS resolution. The knowledge had to be made explicit, and this revealing of implicit knowledge is the real transformation. Organizations do not realize how much operational knowledge lives in the heads of experts until they try to automate it. You cannot automate intuition, so you have to convert that intuition into rules. Making the invisible visible is an uncomfortable process that exposes gaps. It reveals that some experts cannot actually articulate their own decision-making process, and it shows that different experts solve the same problems in different ways. This forces a level of standardization that the organization had previously avoided. The service desk initially pushed back because they felt the system was replacing their expertise. They feared the automation was devaluing their knowledge, which is a legitimate concern that the organization had to address directly. They reframed the conversation by explaining that the system was not replacing expertise, but was instead making that expertise scalable. The senior engineer who spent 40% of his time on repetitive triage could now spend that time on complex problems, meaning the team could handle more tickets with the same headcount and the work became more interesting. Over 6 months, the organization discovered that explicit knowledge made human agents more effective. When a support agent had access to codified decision trees, they could troubleshoot faster and handle more complex issues. They did not have to spend mental energy on basic diagnosis, so ticket complexity decreased and resolution time improved. The mandate was never just to automate the service desk, it was to make operational knowledge explicit and scalable. This pattern repeats across every organization that tries this. Copilot Studio forces knowledge to become explicit, and while that is difficult, it is also transformative. Organizations that embrace this discover that explicit knowledge generates value independent of the automation system itself. Their operations become more efficient and their processes become more consistent. The technology is the mechanism, but the transformation is organizational. The financial impact was significant but secondary to the structural changes. The $1.2 million in annual savings from ticket deflection was real, but the organization also found efficiencies in standardized processes. They saw reduced rework from inconsistent troubleshooting and better first contact resolution rates. New support staff onboarded faster because they could learn from codified knowledge instead of just shadowing experts, so the total value exceeded the headline deflection savings. This is why the mandate is permanent. Copilot does not just automate tasks, it forces you to make your operational knowledge explicit. That forcing function is transformative, and organizations that resist it will see very limited value from automation. Those who embrace it will discover that explicit knowledge generates value that exceeds the automation itself. It is about making the invisible visible and converting implicit expertise into scalable processes. That is the mandate, and it is non-negotiable. Case Study 3. Board-level intelligence, Microsoft 365 Copilot in executive briefings. The mandate eventually reaches the highest levels of organizational decision-making, where the stakes are highest and the data is often the messiest. A Fortune 500 organization recently deployed Microsoft 365 Copilot specifically to handle executive briefings, and the architectural goal was to have the system synthesize board materials by pulling from emails, documents, Teams conversations, and various financial systems. Everyone expected a straightforward outcome where faster briefings would be more comprehensive than what a human team could produce, but the actual results exposed the deepest architectural flaw that most modern organizations are currently hiding. The system performed exactly as it was designed to do. It successfully accessed every available source, synthesized data across thousands of emails, and generated polished briefing summaries for the leadership team. Then the board discovered something terrifying. The summaries contained completely contradictory revenue forecasts because the AI was pulling different numbers from different disconnected systems. It found the same metric defined 3 different ways in 3 different departments, which led to customer sentiment analysis that argued with itself. Strategic priorities appeared to be out of alignment because different executive teams had never actually unified their vision in a way the machine could parse. The board suddenly realized their organization didn't have a single version of truth. In reality, they had dozens of them. Finance operated with one set of numbers, while operations relied on another, and sales maintained a third that didn't match either of the others. Each dataset was internally consistent and technically correct within its own siloed domain, but they simply did not align. Copilot didn't create this misalignment, it merely exposed it. Because the system synthesized across all sources simultaneously and presented every version as equally valid, the board finally saw the fragmented information they had been using for years. This discovery forced a massive internal reckoning. The leadership had to either consolidate their data sources and establish unified governance or accept that every AI-driven decision would be based on contradictory garbage. They chose to implement Microsoft Fabric as a unified data foundation to create one system of record for the entire company. This meant establishing one definition for every metric and one source of truth that everyone had to follow. The project took 18 months and cost $2.8 million to complete. It required the team to consolidate data from dozens of legacy systems while standardizing definitions that had been different for decades. They had to finally decide which version of the truth was actually true. Was the finance definition of revenue the right one, or did sales have it right? Should they use the operations customer satisfaction score or the one from customer service? These weren't technical questions for the IT department. They were fundamental organizational questions that required difficult conversations and total executive alignment. But the results after implementation were transformative. Decision-making became significantly faster, not because Copilot magically got smarter, but because every decision was finally based on unified and trusted data. The board could see actual market trends instead of fighting through contradictory signals from different vice presidents. Finance could finally reconcile with operations, and sales could align with customer service because the organization had become architecturally coherent. Copilot was now operating on clean data, which made the briefings reliable and the system truly strategic. The mandate revealed itself through this painful transformation. The organization didn't actually deploy Copilot just to get better briefings. They deployed it and discovered their data was broken. By implementing Fabric and unifying their information, they generated value that far exceeded the direct ROI of the AI itself. They gained better decision-making, faster alignment, and a massive reduction in the rework that usually comes from conflicting information. The entire company became more efficient and more trustworthy. This is the recurring pattern at the board level. Organizations deploy Copilot expecting a small, incremental improvement in how executives see the business. Instead, they are exposed to fundamental architectural gaps that they can no longer ignore. They are forced to choose between accepting fragmented information or doing the hard work of unifying their data. Most choose unification, and they quickly discover that this process generates massive value entirely independent of any AI system. The uncomfortable truth is that most organizations are currently operating on fragmented data at the highest levels. Different executives see different numbers, and different departments define success differently because the organization has never been forced to unify. When Copilot tries to synthesize across that mess, the fragmentation becomes visible to everyone. The mandate forces this visibility and demands a choice. You must either fix your data architecture or accept that your AI will present lies to your board. That is not an optional upgrade. It is architectural law. This transformation matters because it isn't about Copilot at all. It is about what Copilot forces your organization to become. The security paradox. Copilot exists as both a security tool and a security liability at the same time. This paradox defines the current threat landscape for every architect. On one hand, 95% of organizations report that AI is making their security more effective, and half of them are seeing much faster threat detection. Copilot can analyze logs at a machine scale that no human could match. It correlates events that people would naturally miss and identifies patterns in security data that would normally take analysts weeks to surface. The defensive value of the system is undeniable. On the other hand, Copilot repositories are showing 40% higher rates of secret leakage. 77% of organizations have already experienced some kind of AI-related breach in the last year. GitHub Copilot users are inadvertently exposing AWS credentials and API tokens at much higher rates because the system pulls from more context sources than a human developer ever would. The offensive risk is just as real as the defensive benefit. The paradox is entirely architectural. Copilot respects your existing permissions, but it operates at a scale that immediately exposes every permission misconfiguration you've ignored. If a developer has access to a private repository, they can use Copilot to query it, which is technically correct behavior. But if that repository contains hard-coded secrets because the developer was careless, Copilot now has access to those secrets at machine scale. The system is operating exactly as intended, but your security posture is failing. Consider a real incident from June of 2025 where GitHub Copilot users inadvertently exposed sensitive information through their prompt context. The system was pulling from more sources than the developers realized at the time. A developer would type a simple prompt, and Copilot would include nearby code as context to help with the suggestion. Because that nearby code contained active API keys, those keys were included in the AI's response. The developer then copied the suggestion without noticing the keys were embedded in the text. The system worked perfectly, but the developer's security hygiene was non-existent. This is where the mandate intersects with your security strategy. Organizations that treat Copilot as a specific security problem rather than a broader governance problem will continue to struggle. The issue is not the AI. The issue is that your underlying data and permission architecture is exposing secrets at scale. Copilot is simply the tool that is making that existing exposure visible to the world. The forcing function works quite simply. Organizations must implement security controls at the underlying data and permission layers rather than trying to fix the Copilot layer. This means you need much stronger secret scanning and more rigorous access reviews across the board. You have to implement tighter DLP policies and treat secret exposure as a fundamental permission problem. A developer should never have hard-coded secrets in a repository, and a repository should never have broad permissions that expose secrets to the wrong people. Copilot is just operating within the broken boundaries you already built. Organizations that recognize this reality will use Copilot as a reason to finally improve their underlying security posture. They will implement automated scanning and enforce policies that prevent hard-coded credentials from ever being checked in. They will conduct regular access reviews to ensure every repository is permissioned correctly. They will use DLP tools to detect and prevent leakage before it happens. These improvements help the company regardless of whether they use AI, but they become urgent when you deploy a system that operates at machine speed. Organizations that keep treating Copilot as the primary security problem will continue to see breaches. They will try to implement Copilot-specific controls and restrict what the AI can access. They will monitor the outputs for secrets and create massive friction around the tool. But because they won't fix the underlying architecture, their secrets will continue to leak through different channels. The uncomfortable truth is that this security paradox isn't actually new. Organizations have always dealt with the tension between being productive and being secure. Developers want access to code while security teams want to lock it down. Copilot just makes that tension visible at a scale we've never seen before. When a human developer searches a repository, they are limited by their own brain and can't see everything at once. When Copilot searches that same repository, it traverses the entire code base in seconds. If that code contains secrets, the AI will find them. This doesn't happen because Copilot is insecure. It happens because the code base was never secure to begin with. The mandate forces you to implement a security architecture that is robust enough to withstand machine-scale access. This means secrets can no longer live in repositories. They must live in secure vaults. Permissions must be tight enough that even if a repository is compromised, the sensitive systems remain protected. Your DLP policies must be strong enough to detect and stop leaks before they leave the building. Organizations that build this architecture will see Copilot become their greatest security asset. The system will analyze logs and identify threats that humans would never catch. It becomes a massive force multiplier for your security operations team. Organizations that ignore this will see Copilot become their biggest liability. It will expose their secrets, reveal their over-permissioned accounts, and amplify every existing gap in their defense. The paradox only resolves when you stop treating security as a hurdle and start treating it as a foundation. Copilot doesn't create new risks, it exposes the ones you already had. Organizations that fix those risks will emerge much stronger than before. The mandate is clear. Your security architecture must be strong enough to handle machine-scale access. That is architectural law, and it is why this paradox is actually the best security opportunity you've ever had, and the skills transformation nobody expected. Organizations deploying Copilot at scale are discovering that the technology reshapes skill requirements in ways nobody anticipated. This isn't about hiring differently, but rather a workforce transformation that cuts deeper than job titles or training programs. Entry-level coding jobs are disappearing, while mid-level judgment roles are expanding. And the data backs this up. 38% of employers have already cut entry-level roles due to AI, and nearly 40% of managers now prefer mid-level talent over fresh graduates. This is not a case of AI replacing junior developers, but rather AI replacing the specific parts of junior developer work that don't require human judgment. The foundational mistake is assuming the job description stays the same while the tools change. A junior developer's job traditionally involved learning syntax, writing boilerplate code, and gradually building toward more complex problems. That progression made sense when syntax and boilerplate consumed 60% of the work, but Copilot automates those parts entirely. Now, a junior developer's job is to understand what boilerplate should look like, evaluate whether Copilot's suggestion is correct, and modify it when needed. That requires judgment, it requires experience, and it requires the kind of understanding that typically comes from years of writing the very code the AI is now generating. This creates a paradox that most leadership teams are failing to navigate. Organizations need fewer people writing boilerplate, yet they need more people who actually understand what good boilerplate looks like. The entry-level pipeline disappears while mid-level talent becomes scarce, and you cannot simply hire your way out of this architectural erosion. You have to build your way out by investing in upskilling existing staff rather than hunting for entry-level talent that no longer fits the workflow. One software development firm that usually hired 20 junior developers per year discovered they could achieve the same output with 12 mid-level developers augmented by Copilot. That represents a 40% reduction in entry-level hiring, but the transition required 6 months of training, mentoring, and a complete workflow redesign. The organization that invested in this transformation gained a massive competitive advantage, while those that simply laid off junior staff discovered they had no pipeline for future leaders. They had effectively eliminated the entry level without creating a viable path to mid-level expertise. This is the skills transformation nobody expected, because it isn't about replacing people, it is about changing which skills actually matter. Syntax memorization is becoming less valuable by the day, while understanding architecture and system design is becoming the new gold standard. The ability to evaluate AI-generated code is now a critical requirement, and the capacity to modify and improve suggestions has become essential for any functioning team. The foundational skill is now thinking about what the code should do, rather than just knowing how to write it. Organizations are responding to this shift in two very different ways. Some are investing heavily in upskilling programs to take junior developers and accelerate them toward mid-level expertise. They are teaching their teams to work alongside Copilot to build the internal pipeline that entry-level hiring used to provide. These organizations will emerge stronger because they will have teams that understand their code base deeply, and they will possess institutional knowledge that cannot be easily replicated by a competitor. Other organizations are cutting entry-level roles without investing a single dollar in upskilling their remaining staff. They are reducing headcount and assuming that mid-level talent will always be available in the market, but they are not planning for the long-term reality. These organizations will struggle because the mid-level talent market is incredibly tight and competition for experienced developers is fierce. By eliminating the internal pipeline that traditionally developed future leaders, they are essentially mortgaging their future for short-term gains. The mandate reveals itself in this transformation. Organizations must invest in continuous learning or watch their workforce become obsolete. This isn't happening because Copilot is replacing people, but because Copilot is changing the very definition of professional competence. Organizations that recognize this will build learning programs and create clear pathways for developers to grow from junior to senior levels. They will treat skill development as a strategic capability rather than an HR checkbox. Organizations that ignore this reality will eventually face a massive skills crisis. They will have fewer entry-level developers because Copilot eliminated that work, and they will have trouble hiring mid-level developers because the market is too competitive. They will be left with a workforce that is simply not prepared for AI-augmented development, and the technology will expose their lack of investment in their own people. The uncomfortable truth is that Copilot's impact on skills is more profound than its impact on productivity. The productivity gains are real, but they are secondary to the fundamental shift in what skills matter for the next decade. The organizations that understand this will thrive, while the ones that don't will struggle to keep the lights on. The mandate is simple: invest in continuous learning or fall behind. That is not a suggestion, it is organizational law, and it is why this transformation is changing business forever. It is not about the technology, but about what the technology forces your organization to become. The cost structure inversion. Most organizations view GitHub Copilot as a simple productivity booster, but the reality is that it makes writing code cheaper while making the act of owning that code much more expensive. This inversion is the economic trap that many leaders fall into because they focus on the initial speed of creation rather than the long-term cost of maintenance. While a developer might produce code 55% faster with AI assistance, the resulting pull requests are often 20% larger, which forces teams to spend significantly more time on rigorous reviews. Ownership accountability becomes harder to pin down when the machine is doing the heavy lifting, and this causes the entire cost structure of software development to flip on its head. The foundational mistake is measuring success by lines of code per hour. Copilot wins that race every time, but that metric is a vanity project that ignores what actually hits the bottom line. What truly matters is the amount of working, secure software you get for every dollar spent, and that is where the story gets complicated. Because the tool accelerates generation without speeding up security validation or human review, the total cost per unit of finished software often shifts in ways that catch management off guard. A financial services firm recently learned about this inversion the hard way after deploying Copilot across their engineering teams. Their developers started closing tickets at a record pace, which initially looked like a massive win for the department. However, the code review process quickly became a massive bottleneck because the larger AI-generated pull requests required much more careful human oversight to catch subtle errors. They eventually had to hire more security specialists and build entirely new, automated testing frameworks just to handle the sheer volume of code being produced. The price of a single line of code went down, but the complexity and cost of the surrounding organization went through the roof. This is the uncomfortable economic reality of the AI era that nobody wants to talk about. Copilot creates visible time savings during the drafting phase, but it simultaneously generates invisible costs that only appear when a system fails or a deadline is missed. Code review overhead and the dilution of individual ownership act as a tax on those productivity gains, which means the net benefit is often much smaller than the marketing materials suggest. Organizations that actually thrive in this environment are the ones that optimize their entire pipeline from start to finish. They don't just give developers a login, they automate the review process where possible and build security frameworks that can scale alongside the AI. They establish clear models for who is responsible for AI-assisted work, and they measure the end-to-end cost of a feature rather than just looking at how fast someone typed it out. They capture the real value of the technology by redesigning every workflow that happens downstream from the keyboard. Organizations that miss this point will celebrate their initial speed and then wonder why their projects are stalling 6 months later. They deploy the tool to every desk and calculate a theoretical ROI based on time saved, but they aren't prepared for the friction that follows. The productivity gains are real, but they are being eaten alive by hidden costs that the organization simply wasn't built to manage. The mandate here is unavoidable. You have to redesign your cost structures if you want to capture the value that Copilot offers. You cannot just drop a high-speed engine into an old car and expect everything to hold together. Copilot doesn't necessarily reduce your total spend. It redistributes it by making the doing cheaper and the checking much more expensive. Successful leaders will shift their resources away from drafting and toward high-level review and robust security frameworks. Treating Copilot as a simple cost-cutting measure is a recipe for disappointment. The tool is an efficiency engine, but it changes the very shape of the work in a way that demands a new economic model. Some companies will come out ahead because they leaned into this new structure, while others will end up paying more for software that is harder to maintain. The technology itself is neutral, which means your organizational response is the only thing that determines if you win or lose. The uncomfortable truth is that the economic impact of AI depends more on organizational discipline than the software itself. It depends on whether you are willing to tear down and rebuild your workflows, but most companies are looking for a shortcut that doesn't exist. They want the speed without the redesign, which is an architectural impossibility in a system this complex. Copilot creates gains in one area and creates debt in another, and managing that balance requires a level of precision that most teams haven't mastered yet. That is not a suggestion. It is economic law, and it is why the cost structure inversion is the most important business shift of the decade. The governance framework imperative. Organizations are currently being forced to build governance frameworks that simply do not exist at scale yet. This is the uncomfortable reality of the modern enterprise. Traditional governance models were built for human decision-making and slow, explicit workflows where a person signed a physical form or clicked an approval button. Copilot does not work that way. It operates in a high-velocity space where decisions are implicit, distributed, and happening every second. The old frameworks you use to approve a department budget or authorize a hardware purchase are useless when an AI system makes thousands of micro-decisions a day across your entire data estate. You need a new model that covers 3 very specific architectural domains. First is prompt governance, which defines exactly what questions Copilot is allowed to answer and which topics are strictly off-limits for the engine. Second is output governance, where you establish how to validate responses and decide when a human must step in to verify accuracy. Finally, you have data governance to determine what information the AI can actually touch and what retention policies apply to the summaries it generates. These frameworks are not sitting on a shelf waiting for you to download them. Most organizations are inventing them in real time while the system is already running. Some try to stretch old compliance rules to fit this new shape, while others sit back and wait for the industry to release a standard. Waiting is a mistake because Copilot is already active and making decisions on your behalf right now. If you are operating without a specific AI governance framework, you are essentially operating blind. Consider a recent case from the healthcare sector where an organization deployed Copilot to assist with clinical decisions. They expected faster analysis and better patient outcomes, but the deployment immediately exposed a massive governance vacuum. The system began generating clinical recommendations by synthesizing sensitive patient data, yet there was no internal process to validate those suggestions. There was no audit trail for regulators and no clear rule for when a doctor had to override the machine. They had dropped a powerful AI into one of the most regulated industries on Earth without a single guardrail designed to manage it. The recovery was painful because they had to build the entire plane while it was in the air. They spent months defining which clinical questions were safe for the AI and establishing strict accuracy thresholds for different types of medical advice. They had to hard-code audit trails for compliance and create escalation protocols so high-risk recommendations would always hit a human desk. This required clinicians, lawyers, and security engineers to work together for months on a framework that should have existed on day one. Without that work, the organization was technically operating outside the law. This is the recurring pattern of the AI era. You deploy the tool, you discover the massive gaps in your oversight, and then you are forced to build a framework under duress. The forcing function here is almost always regulatory risk. Whether it is HIPAA in healthcare, SOX in finance, or FedRAMP in government, these regulations demand a level of accountability that Copilot does not natively provide. These laws require audit trails and human oversight, but the AI operates outside those traditional boundaries. You have to bend your frameworks to catch up to the technology. The mandate today is to implement structures like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework or ISO 42001, but you must adapt them for a continuous distributed system. These standards provide a solid structure and define your domains of responsibility, but they are not a step-by-step manual. They tell you what to think about, not exactly what to do in your specific tenant. You are responsible for translating these abstract high-level frameworks into an operational reality that actually stops bad decisions. Most leadership teams will resist this because they see governance as pure friction. They believe it slows down innovation and creates a mountain of useless bureaucracy. To be fair, poorly designed governance does exactly that. However, well-implemented governance is actually what allows you to innovate at scale because it builds the underlying trust required to move fast. Organizations that build strong frameworks before they hit the scale button will always outpace the ones that try to fix the chaos later. The uncomfortable truth is that these frameworks are the only foundation for trustworthy AI. If you don't have them, you have no idea what decisions your system is making or what data it is leaking. You cannot audit your outcomes, and you certainly cannot prove compliance to a regulator during an inquiry. You are essentially betting the future of your company on a system that has no brakes and no steering wheel. Your mandate is clear. You must implement these frameworks before you scale Copilot across the enterprise. You need to define your prompt policies, establish your validation steps, and lock down your data governance immediately. These rules will not be perfect at first, and they will definitely evolve as you learn how the system behaves. But they are mandatory. Without them, Copilot is a massive liability that creates architectural erosion. With them, it becomes a controlled strategic asset that provides a durable competitive advantage. The data architecture reckoning. Copilot is only as effective as the data it can reach, and it performs best when that data is unified, fresh, and strictly governed. Most organizations are currently failing this test because their data estates are fragmented across dozens of different silos. You likely have multiple CRMs, disconnected data warehouses, and several conflicting versions of the truth. The AI mandate is now forcing a move toward unified architectures like Microsoft Fabric or data lakehouse patterns. This is no longer a simple technology choice for the IT department. It is a fundamental necessity for the business to function. We see this clearly in the manufacturing sector. One firm with nearly 50 separate data systems realized Copilot was giving users contradictory information because it was pulling from different truths simultaneously. One database showed 50 units in stock, while another showed 32 and a third claimed 45. Each system was technically correct within its own narrow silo, but because they weren't synchronized, Copilot synthesized them all into a single, confusing mess. The organization had to admit that their underlying data architecture was fundamentally broken. They spent 18 months and nearly $3 million consolidating those 47 systems into Microsoft Fabric. While that sounds like a massive burden, the project actually generated over $4 million in annual value before Copilot even finished its first task. The value came from the fact that the organization finally became coherent. Managers stopped arguing about which inventory report was real, and the finance team stopped wasting weeks reconciling numbers that should have matched. The technology was the catalyst for the change, but the real transformation was organizational. This reckoning forces three massive shifts in how you handle information. First, you have to stop tolerating fragmentation and move toward a unified platform. Whether you choose a centralized warehouse or a hybrid fabric model, the era of good enough silos is over. Copilot exposes these gaps at a scale that humans never could, and the business can no longer afford the errors that come with disconnected data. Second, you have to move toward active data governance. This means automated classification, constant quality monitoring, and metadata management are now foundational requirements rather than nice-to-have projects. If you consolidate bad data, you just end up with bad data at a much larger scale. You must ensure that the information being fed into the AI engine is clean, tagged, and verified before the system starts making decisions based on it. Third, you must establish absolute data ownership. You need to know exactly who owns the customer records and who is accountable for the accuracy of the financial figures. Without clear ownership, your unified data platform will just become a political battleground for different departments. Teams will argue over definitions and fight over access rights, creating more conflict than clarity. Unified data requires a clear human hierarchy to function. Most companies will try to avoid this reckoning because it is expensive and tedious. Consolidating data is hard work, and establishing ownership creates a level of accountability that many people find uncomfortable. So they delay. They deploy Copilot on top of their fragmented mess and then act surprised when the system hallucinations or exposes sensitive information. They are trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. The uncomfortable truth is that your data architecture is the ceiling for your AI's potential. You can buy the most expensive LLM on the planet, but if your data is contradictory and poorly governed, the AI will only amplify those flaws. You can have the best security team in the world, but if your data is scattered across 50 different systems, your security posture is a nightmare. Architecture is the only thing that determines if your AI is an asset or a threat. The mandate is forcing this change, whether you are ready or not. You must consolidate your data, govern it actively, and assign clear ownership to every record. These are not optional upgrades for next year's budget. They are the basic architectural requirements for the AI era. Without this foundation, Copilot is a liability that will eventually fail. With it, the system becomes a strategic engine that drives the entire company forward. The organizations that embrace this unified architecture will be the ones that lead their industries. Their decisions will be faster because their data is reliable, and their AI systems will be more trustworthy than the competition. Those who resist will continue to struggle with chaotic operations and unreliable insights. You must unify your data now or accept that your AI will always be operating on broken information. And that is not a suggestion, it is architectural law. This reckoning is changing the way business works by forcing us to finally build the foundation we should have had years ago. The organizational resistance is real. Most organizations are hitting a wall of human resistance they never saw coming, despite the clear mandate for AI adoption. This isn't some irrational glitch or a failure of the software itself, but rather an organizational reality that most deployment plans completely underestimate. That distinction matters because it is the primary reason why 40% of companies that started Copilot pilots 2 years ago are still stuck in that same pilot phase today. The technology performs exactly as the marketing promised, but the deep organizational transformation required to actually use it hasn't happened yet. To move forward, leadership has to stop looking at adoption dashboards and start confronting human fear directly. The most obvious friction point is that employees are genuinely afraid of being replaced by a machine. We can tell them their jobs are safe, but these people have lived through corporate restructuring and technological shifts before. They know from experience that when a company promises to retrain the workforce, it often serves as a 2-year countdown to a layoff notice. That fear isn't a sign of being difficult. It is a rational response based on a history of seeing how these cycles end. At the same time, middle managers are resisting a fundamental loss of visibility and control over how work gets done. When a developer writes code or an analyst builds a financial model through Copilot, the traditional ways of observing the process disappear. You can no longer watch the work happen in real time because the actual creation is occurring in a private exchange between the human and the AI. Managers are left looking at the final output without seeing the how, and that shift feels like losing their grip on the wheel. In many ways it is. Up in the executive suite, the conversation has shifted toward a skeptical interrogation of the actual return on investment. While the productivity gains are real, they are frequently smaller than what the vendors promised in the sales deck, and the implementation costs always climb higher than the initial budget. These leaders have seen AI hype cycles come and go, so they naturally hesitate and keep pilots small while they wait for better data. This caution creates a feedback loop where they delay expansion because they want proof, but they can't get proof because they won't expand. We can see how to break this cycle by looking at a legal services firm that recently deployed Copilot for contract review. Their junior lawyers were initially terrified that the tool would automate them out of a career. But the firm chose to invest in retraining instead of just pushing the software. They showed these lawyers how to use the AI to handle the grueling, repetitive parts of the job, effectively turning the tool into an assistant rather than a replacement. Within a year, that same team was handling 40% more clients because they weren't wasting mental energy on basic proofreading. Their work became more complex, their pay improved, and the resistance evaporated because the firm addressed the human element first. That success was an outlier because it required a level of deliberate change management that most companies ignore. They didn't just flip a switch and hope for the best. They reframed the entire narrative and proved that the tool created opportunity instead of a threat. Most organizations take the opposite path by rolling out the software, measuring a few quick wins, and then wondering why adoption remains so shallow. Users might use it for a specific task here and there, but they don't fundamentally change their core workflows, leaving the vast majority of the value on the table. This resistance also shows up as a form of organizational inertia, where the company refuses to do the hard work of redesign. Copilot demands new governance frameworks, a cleaner data architecture, and a total rethink of how tasks move through a department. Because these changes are uncomfortable and require significant effort, many organizations try to minimize the disruption by bolting the AI onto their old broken processes. They refuse to rebuild the foundation, and as a result, they only ever capture a tiny fraction of what the technology can actually do. The uncomfortable truth is that the success of Copilot depends far more on your change management strategy than on the code itself. The technology is ready right now, but organizational readiness varies wildly from one office to the next. The companies that choose to invest in their people will be the ones that see a true transformation. They will be the ones who fix the architecture, redesign the workflows, and address the fears of their staff to capture exponential value. If you treat this as just another IT deployment, you are going to see very limited results. You might see a slight bump in speed for specific tasks, and you might even celebrate those small wins in a meeting, but you won't change the way work actually flows. You will miss the systemic value entirely. The mandate is clear. The winners won't be the ones with the best software, but the ones who were brave enough to lead their people through the discomfort of change. Resistance isn't a sign that the AI is failing. It's a sign that changing a culture is slow, expensive, and incredibly difficult. It requires leadership to have honest, sometimes painful conversations about what is changing and why it matters. The organizations that lean into that work will come out the other side completely transformed, while everyone else stays stuck in a permanent pilot phase, measuring minor gains while missing the revolution. The competitive advantage window. The organizations that moved early to integrate Copilot into their core workflows are now sitting on a competitive advantage that will likely last for years. This isn't just a theory or marketing talk, as we can see it happening in companies that started this journey 18 months ago. While everyone else was debating whether to buy licenses, these early adopters were fixing their data estates, rebuilding their governance models, and retraining their entire staff. They are now operating on a structural foundation that is light years ahead of anyone trying to start a deployment today. Take a look at the consulting firm that rolled out Copilot across its entire global operation a year and a half ago. They are now finishing projects 22% faster than they used to, and they've managed to increase the quality of their deliverables by 18% at the same time. That isn't just a marginal improvement, it is a total transformation of their business model. Any competitor trying to start today will spend the next year just trying to catch up to where that firm was on day one. They will have to fight through the same fragmented data, the same weak governance, and the same unprepared workforce before they can even begin to compete on speed. This advantage is designed to compound over time because experience is the one thing you cannot buy or download. The early adopter has 18 months of hard-earned operational knowledge, meaning they already know which prompts work, which workflows fail, and how to keep their data secure. They have built institutional habits and established governance patterns that actually function in the real world. A late adopter has none of that, so they are forced to start from scratch, making the same expensive mistakes and building their frameworks from first principles, while the gap between them and the leader only gets wider. We are currently living in a unique window of opportunity that will eventually close as this technology becomes a standard commodity. Right now, using Copilot effectively is a massive differentiator because it is still relatively new and difficult to get right. In 2 years, every company will have these tools, and the advantage will shift from simply having the software to having it integrated into a clean, optimized environment. The organizations that started early will already be there, while the laggards will still be playing a desperate game of catch-up. You also have to realize that you cannot compress the timeline for organizational change. No matter how much money you throw at the problem, you cannot skip the months it takes to consolidate data or the year it takes to retrain a workforce of thousands. These are structural realities that take time to resolve. If you start today, you might be finished in 18 to 24 months, but if you wait another year to begin, your completion date just slides further into the future. The delay isn't about the technology, it's about the physical time it takes for a human organization to adapt. This competitive edge isn't just about moving faster, but about having a higher level of fundamental capability. A transformed organization has cleaner data and a more skilled workforce, which allows them to take risks that their competitors wouldn't dare to touch. And they can deploy new AI features the moment they drop because their foundation is already solid. They are free to innovate and find new ways to win because they aren't spending all their time fixing the basic architectural problems they should have solved a year ago. The window is closing much faster than most executives realize, and the bottleneck isn't the software, it's the speed of the organization itself. The companies that move now and accept the temporary discomfort of a total redesign are the ones that will secure a durable lead. They are the ones who will invest in the data, build the frameworks, and retrain the people while the opportunity still exists. Those who wait will eventually be forced to move anyway. but they will do it under intense competitive pressure, leading to more mistakes and less overall value. The uncomfortable truth is that the mandate for transformation is not optional. It is a law of competition. You either begin the hard work of rebuilding your foundation now, or you accept that you will be trailing behind your industry for the foreseeable future. This window matters because it represents the difference between leading a market and merely surviving in it. It was never really about the Copilot licenses. It was always about the organizational transformation that the software was designed to trigger. The board conversation you need to have. Most boards are currently asking the wrong questions about Copilot. And that is the uncomfortable reality organizations face when AI deployment finally reaches the executive level. The board usually asks if they should deploy Copilot at all, but the answer is obviously yes, because every competitor is already doing it. The question that actually matters is something else entirely. Are we ready for the organizational transformation the system requires? This is not a technology question, but a strategic one that demands board-level clarity on decisions that will shape the company for years to come. The mandate requires leadership to make hard choices about data architecture, governance frameworks, and workforce transformation, which are business decisions with multi-year and multi-million-dollar implications. Most boards never actually have this conversation, choosing instead to approve Copilot based on shiny vendor presentations and optimistic ROI projections. They measure success by adoption rates and productivity metrics, celebrating when users embrace the tool, only to be shocked later when data quality issues stop the system from working. They find themselves surprised when governance gaps create regulatory risk, or dismayed when workforce transformation takes much longer than the slide deck promised. These are not technical failures, but organizational problems that the board should have dismantled before the first license was ever purchased. The conversation that needs to happen starts with data readiness, and it requires asking if your organization actually has unified data, or if you even know where it lives. You have to identify who owns the information and whether it is accessible, but most boards cannot answer these questions because they have never been forced to try. Operations have always been chaotic, and data has always been fragmented, which was fine until Copilot arrived to expose exactly how deep that chaos really goes. The board needs to ask about the specific data consolidation strategy, whether that means implementing a unified data warehouse, building a lakehouse, or finally adopting Microsoft Fabric. This is a strategic choice with massive financial consequences, much like the real financial services firm that spent $2.8 million just to consolidate data across 47 different systems. That was not a simple IT project, but a strategic investment that required the board to approve the budget and commit to a realistic timeline. The second conversation focuses on governance and whether your organization has established frameworks for responsible AI or processes for validating what the machine produces. You need audit trails for compliance and escalation protocols for high-risk decisions, yet most organizations are currently operating completely blind without these foundational elements in place. The board must ask what frameworks are required, who will be held accountable for them, and what the specific budget and timeline for implementation will look like. The third conversation involves workforce transformation and how Copilot will fundamentally change the way your people do their jobs. You have to determine what new skills are required and how you will manage the transition, similar to a software firm that realized they had to stop hiring 20 junior developers a year. They shifted to hiring only 12 while investing heavily in upskilling their current staff, a move that required the board to understand the shift and approve a massive new training budget. The fourth conversation covers competitive positioning and the specific window of advantage you have before your rivals inevitably catch up. Organizations that deploy Copilot right now will likely hold a durable advantage for 18 to 24 months, but after that, the advantage shifts entirely to execution quality. The board needs to grasp this timeline so they can commit to moving immediately rather than waiting for the market to settle. One Fortune 500 organization illustrates what happens when the board avoids these questions, as they approved a $40 million deployment without ever assessing their data readiness. The entire project stalled because they lacked unified data, forcing the board to approve an additional $15 million project just to fix the foundation they ignored. They wasted significant time and capital because they refused to ask the right questions up front, proving that the board conversation is the ultimate gatekeeper of success. The only board conversation that matters is whether you are truly ready for the transformation Copilot requires, and if the answer is no, you must define exactly what is needed to get there. You need a budget, a timeline, and a person who is ultimately accountable for the results. These are the factors that determine if Copilot becomes a strategic asset or just another expensive mistake on the balance sheet. The uncomfortable truth is that most boards will skip this conversation entirely, preferring to measure productivity gains and celebrate adoption while ignoring the gaps the system reveals. The mandate is to have this discussion before deployment, not after you have already spent the money and hit a wall. You must understand your data, your governance, and your workforce needs before you can expect the technology to deliver any real value. The organizations that do this will emerge transformed, while the ones that don't will simply waste money and opportunity. The permanent shift in how work gets done. Before Copilot, organizations could tolerate fragmented data and inconsistent governance because those inefficiencies were expensive but ultimately manageable. These gaps slowed down operations and created risk, but companies learned to live with the friction by building manual processes around the fragmentation. They accepted that different departments operated with different versions of the truth and understood that governance was usually more aspirational than operational. This was just the standard way of doing business, and the cost of the chaos was simply baked into the overhead. After Copilot, these inefficiencies become immediately visible and incredibly costly because the system exposes fragmentation at a scale that humans cannot ignore. It reveals governance gaps in real time and demonstrates the true price of ad hoc decision-making, meaning organizations can no longer tolerate the mess they previously accepted. This mandate is not a temporary hurdle to clear, but a permanent shift in the architectural requirements of a modern business. This is the core insight that most organizations miss, as they mistakenly view Copilot as a temporary tool that will eventually be replaced by something else. They think the transformation is a one-time event and that they can move on to the next shiny object once the software is installed. They are wrong, because Copilot represents a permanent change in how an organization must function to remain viable. Unified data and strong governance are no longer nice-to-haves but competitive necessities that you cannot simply turn off later. A manufacturing firm showed this clearly when they implemented Copilot across their operations and realized they immediately needed unified data through Microsoft Fabric. They built governance frameworks and invested heavily in training, and 2 years later they had completely transformed their entire operating model. Their data is now unified and their workforce is prepared, while competitors starting today are beginning exactly where this firm was 2 years ago. The gap between them is not just about software, but about the 2 years of organizational maturity they have already gained. The most important part of this story is that the organization never went back to its old, messy way of operating. It would be economically irrational to return to fragmented data and weak governance once you have seen the value of a streamlined system. Unified data generates massive value, and strong governance reduces risk entirely independent of the AI tool itself. Once you have implemented these fundamental changes, the organization has changed its DNA, and going backward is no longer an option. This is the permanent shift, and it is not actually about the Copilot software, but about what the technology forces your organization to become. Once you have unified your data, you operate more efficiently, and once you have strong governance, you operate with significantly lower risk. These improvements persist even if the specific AI technology becomes obsolete tomorrow, because the organizational transformation is the real product. The technology is just the catalyst that forced you to finally fix the foundation. The uncomfortable truth is that this shift will eventually separate organizations into 2 distinct categories based on whether they embraced or resisted the change. The ones that embraced it will have unified data and capable workforces, positioning them to take advantage of whatever technological shift comes next. The ones that resisted will remain fragmented and weak, struggling to adapt because they never did the hard work of cleaning up their internal environment. This separation will only widen over time as early adopters compound their advantage and build institutional knowledge that rivals cannot easily replicate. Late adopters will eventually be forced to transform under extreme pressure, which usually leads to faster moves, more mistakes, and less overall value. They will be playing a game of catch-up that they are architecturally destined to lose. The mandate reveals itself in this permanent shift, and the organizations that understand this will start moving now despite the discomfort of the process. They will invest in data consolidation and build the governance frameworks required to support a modern automated enterprise. They are doing the hard work of becoming fundamentally different organizations, while those who delay will face the same requirements later with much less time to get it right. The shift is permanent, and once you start this transformation, there is no path that leads back to the old way of working. The way work flows has changed, the way decisions are made has changed, and the way your people develop their skills has changed forever. These changes compound over time to create a durable advantage for those who execute them well. You must embrace this permanent shift or accept that you will fall behind, because this is not an optional upgrade but a new law of organizational survival. Copilot is changing business forever, not because of what the code does, but because of what it forces you to become. It is the strategic imperative. The Copilot mandate is not about adopting a new tool. It is a fundamental shift in how your organization makes decisions, manages its data, and develops its talent. That distinction matters. It determines whether this technology becomes a strategic asset or just another expensive distraction sitting on your balance sheet. Organizations that view Copilot as a simple productivity plugin will inevitably miss the transformation opportunity. Those who see it as a forcing function for necessary change will emerge as leaders. This mandate requires 4 foundational shifts, and it starts with a unified data architecture. Most organizations currently operate on fragmented data where different departments use different systems and teams define their core metrics in conflicting ways. This fragmentation is expensive because it slows down every decision while creating internal conflict, and Copilot will expose these structural gaps the moment you turn it on. You must consolidate your data and establish unified definitions to create a single source of truth. This is no longer an IT project, it is an architectural requirement. Second, you need modern governance frameworks that actually function at scale. Traditional governance was designed for human decision-making, but Copilot operates at machine speed with continuous decisions happening across all your distributed data sources. You need frameworks that govern prompt policies, validate outputs, and control data access in a way that is operational rather than just aspirational. These rules must be enforced by design instead of merely suggested. This allows your organization to move faster than competitors who try to bolt governance onto their legacy systems. Third, the mandate requires continuous workforce development because Copilot fundamentally changes which skills actually matter in a modern enterprise. You must invest in upskilling your existing staff and building a learning culture that allows your people to grow alongside the technology as it evolves. Entry-level hiring patterns are going to shift and mid-level talent will become increasingly scarce, which means organizations that invest in internal development will gain an advantage that external hiring cannot replicate. If you cut entry-level roles without investing in upskilling, you are simply scheduling a talent crisis for the near future. Fourth, none of this works without absolute executive commitment. This transformation requires sustained investment over several years and leadership that truly understands the architectural stakes of the mandate. It requires boards that make strategic decisions about data and CEOs who prioritize organizational change just as much as they prioritize the technology deployment itself. Organizations without this level of commitment will deploy the software and then wonder why the results disappoint them. Those who commit will transform fundamentally. The strategic imperative is simple. Organizations that implement these foundational shifts will see their Copilot ROI compound over time. While the initial productivity gains are real, they are small compared to the systemic value that emerges when your data is unified and your people are prepared. If you treat this as an isolated technology, you will see initial gains followed by massive organizational friction. If you treat it as a catalyst for transformation, you will see sustained value creation that your competitors cannot easily mimic. The uncomfortable truth is that most organizations will refuse to make this shift. They will deploy the tool, measure some minor productivity gains, and celebrate those early wins while ignoring the underlying rot in their data. They won't build the necessary governance frameworks or invest in their people. This means they will leave exponential value on the table because they were afraid of the transformation. The window for an early mover advantage is closing rapidly. Organizations that start this transformation now will likely complete their journey in 18 to 24 months, while those who wait will find themselves starting that same 2-year process much later. This gap compounds over time. It gives the early movers a durable advantage, while the laggards face the same difficult requirements under intense competitive pressure. The mandate is clear. You must embrace the transformation or you will fall behind. Consolidate your data, build your governance frameworks, and invest in your people to make strategic decisions about your future. The technology is already ready, even if your organization is not, and the ones who prepare themselves now are the only ones who will thrive. This mandate is permanent architectural law. It is changing the nature of business forever by forcing organizations to become what they should have been all along. It is about building a foundation for trustworthy and efficient operations. That is the true strategic imperative.